Okay, you're going to do an exercise where you're asked to distinguish an auxiliary verb from a lexical verb. That is, you're asked to take a sentence and take a clause and look at a verb in it and say whether it's lexical or auxiliary. So this presentation deals with the differences and between those classes and how you tell what the real differences are and how you find them. First, let's talk about how you identify a verb in general. Remember that in syntactic analysis, you depend more on how a word acts than what it means, not so much on the semantic characteristics, right? First, you ask things like where it can occur in a clause, what kind of suffixes it can take, especially grammatical suffixes, what kind of complements it licenses, stuff like that. With verbs, some of the syntactic and morphological characteristics are these. They can appear in the 6 forms. Remember, there's that list of 6 verb forms in your book. They head clauses, and they take subjects as dependents. So if you have to have a head of the whole clause, it's the verb. The direct object and things like that will be its internal dependence, and the subject is an external dependent. But everything in the sentence modifies the verb, basically. And they show agreement with the subject. Then you can also note the semantic characteristics, which relate to meaning. Remember that? We can say the meaning of a verb refers to an action, event, process, or state that may be helpful to us some way. But in this analysis, what we're going to do mainly is use the morphosyntactic characteristics. If we look at these clauses as examples, we see a few words that we can identify as verbs because they meet the criteria we just talked about. Swim is clearly a verb. We could give it 6 forms: the plain form swim, the plain present swim, the third singular present swims, preterite swam, past participle swum, and gerund participle swimming. 6 forms. It can be the head of a clause, as it is here, and if it is, it will require a subject as a dependent, and that's what we see in the first sentence. They is the subject of swim, and in the lake is an adjunct in the verb phrase. So everything else in the sentence is dependent on swim. It can show agreement with the subject, which we could demonstrate by doing a substitution test with the first sentence and changing the subject to she. From they swim in the lake, we would get she swims in the lake. Agreement. So there's no question that swim is a verb. Now in the second sentence, we see another verb, are, which of course is the plain present form of be, the verb be. We could do all the same tests and show that be is also clearly a verb. In the third sentence, we see the verb start, and that word also would pass all of the tests. None of the other words in these sentences would pass the tests. So we can say that swim, be, and start are the only 3 verbs appearing in this group of sentences. Now let's look at another aspect of how these words act. All of the clauses here are declarative, right? Suppose we want to make them into closed interrogative clauses, the kind you use to ask questions. An interrogative is not a question, and we're going to talk about that later. But you usually make an interrogative when you want to ask a question. We make these into an interrogatives, and this is what we get. Now note that some of the verbs moved, right? We're used to saying that in English the canonical order is subject before verb, but in interrogative clauses the verb moves, so it's before the subject. That's true of some of the verbs here, right? Be moved up in front of the subject in both of the sentences it occurred in. Swimming in the second sentence here, their swimming is also a verb, but it didn't move, did it? Is that because if a sentence has 2 verbs, only the first one moves? Nah. They started swimming has 2 verbs, and the first one doesn't move. They swim in the lake only has 1 verb. That one doesn't move either, right? We don't get swim they in the lake. To make interrogative clauses out of these 2 declarative clauses, we actually have to put in a new verb, do, to take that place in front of the subject. Did they start swimming? Do they swim in the lake? Why is it that some verbs will move to the verb place in front of the subject there in interrogative clauses, but most of them won't? Why is that? It seems like that's one of the inherent properties of verbs. It just looks like there's two kinds of verbs, basically. There's the default kind, and they don't move. But there's a subset of them that does move. That's the kind we call auxiliary verbs. So here we see two normal verbs, the default kind, right? Swim and start. And one auxiliary verb, be. Now, you're probably more used to using the term auxiliary in a sentence like the first one here, where there's another verb in the sentence, right? Swimming. We say that are is the auxiliary and swimming is the main verb, it's often called. Usually an auxiliary verb goes with another verb like that to indicate its aspect or voice, usually. And we call that other verb the lexical verb, or you may be used to calling it the main verb. So in they are swimming, are is an auxiliary verb and swimming is a lexical verb. Are helps show that swim is in its progressive aspect. That's the auxiliary function there. Here's another sentence where be is an auxiliary with the lexical verb call. Now here the auxiliary is helping to show that call is in the passive voice, right? It can indicate aspect or voice. But if we go back to a sentence that we looked at earlier, we see be acting as an auxiliary verb in a sentence where there's no other verb. Are they swimmers? No other verb there, right? Swimmers is a noun. This makes the terminology seem a little strange because we think of an auxiliary as something that's adjoined to something else, right? An auxiliary necessarily implies a main, right? And if you're used to saying main verb instead of auxiliary, then you will want to call be the main verb here because it's the only verb, right? Okay, but when be is used as the only verb in a sentence, we have a special word for that. It's called the copula. And it is kind of a strange phenomenon. The copula is kind of strange. There are a lot of languages where you don't use copulas. If you want to express an identity like X is a swimmer or a quality like X is quite large, you don't even use a verb. You can just say two nouns or a noun and an adjective, or you can use a verb, but it's optional. Okay, so don't worry too much about this problem of be being an auxiliary without a main verb. If you don't like calling be an auxiliary when there's no other verb, you can just think of it like this. In interrogative clauses, auxiliaries and the copula move to the place before the subject. That's fine. Okay, two more things about auxiliary verbs. First of all, cases where a verb can be both, and secondly, modals. First, look at these sentences. Is have a lexical verb or an auxiliary verb? You're looking at the movement, right? Does it move? Trick question, right? Is it a lexical or an auxiliary? Yes. There are some verbs that can be either one. In the first sentence, have moves, right? So it's auxiliary. The aspect that it's indicating there is perfect. Have given is present perfect. Second sentence, they have a conflict of interest here. Do we say, have they a conflict of interest here? We don't really. We're likely to say, do they have? So, have is lexical. And your book talks about this famous sentence from the 50s, excuse me. Have you no shame? Now, in that case, it moved, right? That kind of sentence actually used to be a lot more common. What does that say about change in English regarding have? Notice that in they have given a reason, we have a lexical verb, give. In they have a conflict of interest, have is the only verb, right? It looks like when it's the only verb, it's lexical, not auxiliary, because we say, do you have? But it used to be an auxiliary even without another verb, right? It used to be, even in you have no shame, it could move. So it used to be pretty much like the copula, where it could be an auxiliary verb even without a lexical verb. All right. And some of you might still think that the sentence, have you no shame, sounds all right in some context, which would indicate that the change isn't complete. Okay. Last thing, modals. We have a small group of words like can, should, may, might, must, that sort of thing. Okay, and they seem like they act very similarly to verbs in many ways. And you can see by these examples that they actually act like auxiliary verbs, right? They're moving. Okay, but the thing that they don't do, one of the things they don't do that other verbs do is they don't agree with their subjects. Remember we said that one of the characteristics of verbs is showing agreement with their subjects. All right? And the auxiliaries were doing that. You have she is, but they are. All right? But these verbs don't. The modals don't. They can give, she can give. Or they can, she can. They only have one present form. So do we decide that these are not actually verbs? No. They act like verbs in most other ways. So we're going to decide that they're verbs, but they're exceptional, right? We're going to call them a subclass. So what we end up with is auxiliary verbs are a subset of all the verbs. Modals are a subset of the auxiliaries. All right? Auxiliary verbs do things other verbs can't do, and modals are exceptional, different in some ways from the auxiliaries, so we call them subclasses. And that's pretty much all you need to know about auxiliary and lexical verbs for now. When the exercise asks you to decide if a verb is auxiliary or lexical, you just go straight for that movement test. Make sure the clause is a yes-no interrogative, a closed interrogative. Then, in order to do that, if in order to make it the interrogative one, you moved the verb that they're asking you about to that place in front of the subject, call the verb auxiliary. If you didn't move it, call it lexical. It is true that a sentence can have several auxiliary verbs, and in that case only one moves, because there is only room, so to speak, for one verb before the subject. But this exercise is not going to have a sentence with more than one auxiliary verb. They're not going to trick you like that. So just take the test at face value. Make sure that your answer accords with your evidence, which is to say, if you moved the verb, call it auxiliary. If you didn't move it, call it lexical.